At a little after 7 o'clock on a clear October evening, an air traffic controller in Melbourne heard a young pilot calmly report that another aircraft was flying near him over the water. So, the controller checked his traffic board, looked for anything that should have been there, and then told the pilot there was no known aircraft anywhere close to him, and that should have ended it. But it didn't, because the pilot stayed on the radio. And over the next several minutes, he kept describing something above him with 4 bright green lights moving around his small plane in a way he could not explain. Then his engine started running rough. Then he said the object was hovering, and then right before his radio turned into a long metallic scraping sound, he said it was not an aircraft. Hey everyone, tonight we're looking at one story, and it starts with one small plane, one young pilot, and 6 minutes of radio traffic over one of the most dangerous stretches of water in Australia. And before we get into it, if you like strange, dark, and mysterious stories told in story format, then subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Okay, let's get into the story. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, 20-year-old Frederick Valentich climbed into a small Cessna aircraft and prepared for a flight over Bass Strait, the strip of water between mainland, Australia, and Tasmania. The plane was not large. It was the kind of aircraft where the pilot sits close to the instruments, close to the windshield, and close to every vibration coming through the frame. Frederick was young, but he was not treating the flight like some careless trip. He had a route, a destination, and a radio connection to Melbourne Air Traffic Control. Outside the cockpit, the last light of the evening was fading across the water. Inside, the instrument panel glowed softly in front of him, and the engine made that steady, familiar sound that small plane pilots learned to listen to without thinking. Bass Strait had a reputation. Sailors and pilots both knew the water could change quickly, and the distance between land and safety could feel much longer once the sky went dark. But that evening, the weather itself did not appear to be the problem. Frederick took off, climbed out, and settled into the flight the way pilots do when everything is still normal. For a while, there was nothing for anyone on the ground to worry about. Frederick was just another pilot speaking to air traffic control. The controller could hear him clearly. His voice was controlled, practical, and focused on the work of flying. He was not calling for help. He was not saying he was lost. He was just moving through the evening sky over dark water. Then, Frederick saw lights. At first, that did not have to mean anything unusual. Pilots see lights at night all the time. A distant aircraft can look closer than it is. Stars can sit low on the horizon and appear to move when the plane moves. Reflections can show up in cockpit glass and confuse the eye for a second. So, Frederick did what a pilot is supposed to do. He called Melbourne and reported what he was seeing. He told the controller that there appeared to be an aircraft near him. He described 4 bright lights, and he said they were green. He believed this aircraft was close enough to matter, close enough that he needed to ask about it. So the controller checked for traffic in Frederick's area, and from the ground, the answer was simple. There was nothing there. That answer should have made the situation smaller. It should have turned the lights into a harmless mistake, maybe another plane farther away, maybe a visual illusion, maybe something on the horizon that Frederick would lose sight of after a minute, but Frederick did not drop it. He kept watching the lights, and the more he watched, the less they behaved like something ordinary. He reported that the object was passing over him. Then he described it as moving around him. It was not just a dot far away in the sky. From his perspective, it was close, active, and above his aircraft. In that little cockpit, Frederick would have been looking up through the windshield, then back down at his instruments, then up again, trying to keep the plane steady while also tracking whatever was moving outside. The controller had a very different problem. From the ground, he had only Frederick's voice. There was no second pilot calling in, no known aircraft on a route that matched the report, no clean traffic conflict he could solve by telling one plane to climb and another to descend. There was just a young pilot over Bass Strait calmly describing something that was not supposed to be there. Frederick tried to explain it in physical terms. He did not immediately jump to some wild conclusion. He talked about lights. He talked about movement. He talked about position. He said it looked metallic. He was doing what people do when they are trying to make something impossible feel ordinary enough to report. He kept reaching for normal aviation language, but the details kept slipping away from it. Then the situation changed again. Frederick said his engine was running rough. That was different. Strange lights can be misread. A pilot can mistake distance or motion, especially at night, over water. But an engine running rough in a small plane is a direct problem. That sound is right there with you. The vibration changes. The rhythm changes. The cockpit, which had been steady a few minutes earlier, starts to feel like a machine that may not keep its promise. Still, there was a reasonable explanation. Frederick could have become distracted by the lights and started flying in a way that affected the aircraft. He could have become disoriented. Over dark water, without city lights or a clear horizon, a pilot can lose the physical sense of what the plane is doing. The body can say one thing while the instruments say another. That has happened to pilots before, but Frederick was still talking. He was still describing the object, and he was not describing a quick flash or a single strange moment. He was describing something that remained with him long enough for a real conversation to happen. The controller asked questions. Frederick answered. Seconds passed. Then, minutes passed. And the lights were still part of the flight. For about 6 minutes, Frederick and Melbourne stayed connected. 6 minutes does not sound long until you place it inside a cockpit at night. 6 minutes is enough time for a pilot to scan the instruments over and over. Enough time to check the engine sound? Enough time to look through the windshield and realize the thing you hoped would disappear is still there. The controller continued trying to understand what Frederick was seeing, but every answer seemed to create more space instead of less. The object appeared to be moving strangely. It appeared to be above him. It had 4 green lights. It seemed to be circling or orbiting near the Cessna, and all of this was happening while air traffic control had no known aircraft to match it. Then Frederick said the line that would stay with this case for decades. He said, "It's hovering." And then he said, "And it's not an aircraft." After that, his voice stopped. For a moment, there was no clear final sentence, no mayday, no full explanation of what he was about to do. Instead, the radio carried roughly 17 seconds of metallic scraping. It was not a normal sign-off. It did not sound like a pilot calmly ending a transmission. It was a harsh mechanical noise stretched across the frequency, and then it was gone. On the ground, the controller could still follow procedure. He could call Frederick again, he could wait, he could check the frequency and try to reestablish contact. That is what aviation systems are built for. But there is a difference between a delayed reply from a plane over land and a missing reply from a small aircraft over Bass Strait at night. Frederick did not answer. Soon, the radio exchange became a missing aircraft case. Search crews began looking across the area where Frederick and his Cessna should have been. Planes and boats searched the water. They were not trying to solve the whole mystery at first. They were trying to find anything simple enough to prove where the aircraft had gone down. They looked for wreckage. They looked for oil on the surface. They looked for a seat cushion, a wing panel, a piece of floating debris, a body, a personal item, anything that could turn the open water into a location. In a crash over the sea, even a small object can become the beginning of an answer. But in this case, the sea gave them nothing confirmed. That absence became one of the most important facts. Small planes do not always leave large wreckage fields, especially in deep or rough water. But they usually leave something somewhere, or at least enough to support a basic conclusion. With Frederick, there was no confirmed aircraft, no confirmed body, no confirmed final point on the map. In the days after he vanished, the case began to divide into 2 different versions. The first version was the official aviation problem. Investigators had to consider pilot error, spatial disorientation, engine trouble, night flying over dark water, and the possibility that Frederick had misidentified lights in the sky before losing control of the Cessna. That version had logic behind it. He was young, the flight was at night, Bass Strait is unforgiving, a pilot who becomes fixated on lights outside the cockpit can stop trusting the instruments without realizing it. If the aircraft banked or descended over dark water, Frederick might not have had enough time or altitude to recover. But then there was the other version, the one that grew from the radio call itself. Because Frederick did not just vanish after a single confused report, he spoke for several minutes. He described the same object more than once. He said it had green lights. He said it moved around him. He said it was metallic. He said it hovered. And then he said it was not an aircraft. Those details made the case difficult to fold neatly into a routine accident. Maybe he was wrong about what he saw. Maybe his mind was trying to organize confusing visual information in the dark. But even if every unusual thing he reported had a normal explanation, the timing still left a problem. His final words and the metallic scraping sound came right before the Cessna disappeared completely. There were other theories too. Some people wondered if Frederick had encountered an aircraft that was not supposed to be in that area. Others believed he had seen something that could not be identified by ordinary means. Those theories were harder to prove, but the lack of wreckage left enough empty space for them to stay alive. The 17 seconds of sound became its own part of the case. People listened to it and tried to imagine what could have made it. A failing radio, a mechanical problem, a microphone picking up noise inside the cockpit, the aircraft breaking apart. The sound did not explain itself. It simply arrived after Frederick's last words and then cut off. For Frederick's family, none of the theories could replace the thing they did not have. They did not have him, they did not have the aircraft, they did not have a recovered body or a confirmed crash site. Their son had gone up in a small plane on a clear evening and disappeared into a space between official explanation and unanswered radio traffic. Over time, investigators continued to lean toward practical explanations. Disorientation and a crash into Bass Strait remained among the most grounded possibilities. That may well be what happened. The ocean is capable of hiding wreckage for years, and many disappearances that look strange at first eventually turn out to be accidents shaped by bad timing, darkness, and water. But Frederick Valentich's case never became clean. It had too many details that stopped just short of explanation. The ground reported no known aircraft near him. Frederick continued describing one anyway. His engine began running rough. He said the object was hovering. He said it was not an aircraft. Then came the metallic sound, and after that, nothing. Today, Frederick's Cessna has still not been recovered. No confirmed wreckage has been found. No final cause has been established. The official possibilities remain practical, but the final 6 minutes still do not sit comfortably as a normal accident report. And that is where the story remains. Not in a solved file, not in a clean crash site, and not in a place where every witness can agree on what happened. It remains inside a small cockpit over Bass Strait, with a young pilot looking out into the dark at 4 green lights, still calm enough to speak into the radio, while something above him moved in a way he could not name. Then his voice stopped, metal scraped across the frequency, and the water below kept everything else. On January 30th, 1979, a Boeing 707 cargo jet sat at Narita International Airport outside Tokyo while ground crews finished loading the last of its freight. The airplane did not have rows of passengers waiting to sit down or children pressing their faces to the windows. It was a working aircraft built to move weight across long distances, and that night it was supposed to cross the Pacific. The men preparing the flight had done this kind of work before. Cargo flights are not glamorous from the outside. They are schedules, manifests, fuel checks, radio calls, weather reports, and paperwork. A pallet is loaded, a door is secured, a signature is made, and then the aircraft becomes one more machine in a global system that depends on everyone doing ordinary tasks correctly. The captain was Gilberto Araujo da Silva, an experienced Varig pilot. He and the 5 other crew members were flying from Japan toward Brazil, with the route eventually taking them back to Rio de Janeiro. For them, the flight was long, but not impossible. It was the kind of distance that required discipline more than drama, with hours of ocean beneath them and very little to look at once the Japanese coast disappeared behind the aircraft. Inside the cargo hold, though, there was something unusual. Among the freight were 153 original paintings by Manabu Mabe, a celebrated Japanese-Brazilian artist. The paintings were valuable more than $1 million combined, and they were traveling in the dark belly of the plane like any other shipment, wrapped and secured among the normal sounds of metal straps and locked cargo doors. At first, that detail would not have seemed like the beginning of a mystery. Valuable cargo moves by air all the time. Paintings travel to exhibitions, buyers, museums, and private collections. They are insured, logged, packed, and handed from one system to another. On paper, the paintings were just part of the manifest. They did not make the airplane less stable. They did not change the weather. They were freight. The Boeing lifted off from Narita and climbed into the night. Beneath it were lights, roads, airport buildings, and the edge of Japan. Ahead was the Pacific, a huge dark space where pilots rely on instruments, navigation, radio, and procedure. In the cockpit, the crew settled into the early rhythm of the flight, the period after takeoff when the airplane climbs, turns, and begins becoming part of the route. For the first 30 minutes, nothing about the flight suggested an emergency. There was a routine radio check. The aircraft was airborne, moving as expected, and still close enough to the beginning of the trip that everyone on the ground could imagine it following the planned line out over the ocean. A cargo plane leaving Tokyo for Brazil is not something people stop to think about unless it fails to arrive. Then Varig Flight 967 went silent. There was no dramatic distress call, no clear report of fire, no message saying the crew had lost control, no radio transmission that gave investigators a final technical clue. The airplane was there, then it was not communicating. And with a large commercial jet over the Pacific, silence quickly becomes a physical problem. A plane that stops talking still has to be somewhere. The first normal explanation was radio trouble. Equipment fails, a crew can miss a call or have a communication issue. Air traffic systems are built with layers because not every lost contact means disaster. People on the ground could try again, check other frequencies, and wait for the aircraft to reappear through another point in the system. But the waiting did not fix it. Flight 967 did not resume contact, it did not report a diversion, it did not land somewhere unexpected with a damaged radio. The silence stretched until the only responsible assumption was that something had gone wrong over the water. And then the search began. Aircraft and ships were sent out across the Pacific off Japan looking for any sign of the missing Boeing. A 707 is not a small airplane. It carries fuel, metal cargo equipment, seats for crew, and thousands of parts that do not simply dissolve. Searchers expected something. Even a violent crash into the sea can leave oil floating debris, insulation, luggage, scraps of cargo, or pieces of the aircraft structure. They found nothing. That is the part that made the disappearance different. A plane can crash in deep water and be difficult to recover. A search area can be wide. Currents can spread wreckage. Weather can interfere. But Flight 967 seemed to vanish without leaving the basic signs people look for after an ocean crash. No confirmed wreckage, no oil slick, no bodies, no floating cargo, nothing that said here is where the aircraft ended. The families of the 6 crew members were left with the kind of absence that is hard to explain to anyone who has not lived inside it. A crash is already unbearable, but a crash without a location becomes something else. There is no final place to stand. No piece of metal to touch, no recovered cockpit voice, no last movement, no confirmed second where the living became the dead. Investigators had to work backward from very little. The aircraft took off. It made routine contact. It disappeared about 30 minutes later. From that thin line, they had to consider mechanical failure, explosion, structural problem, navigation issue, deliberate interference, or something involving the cargo. Every theory needed evidence, and the evidence was mostly missing. Mechanical failure was possible. Airplanes are machines, and machines can fail in ways crews cannot always overcome. A sudden catastrophic event could have taken down the Boeing before the pilots had time to speak. But even then, there should have been pieces. A crash site might be hard to locate, but the absence of debris kept pulling the case away from a clean accident explanation. An onboard fire or explosion was another possibility. Cargo flights can carry materials that create risks, and fires at altitude can move fast. But again, no message came from the crew, and no physical trace appeared. For a large aircraft to break apart or fall into the ocean and leave nothing confirmed behind created a gap that every practical explanation had to cross. Then there was the cargo. The 153 paintings by Manabu Mabe were worth more than $1.2 million. and their presence gave the case a different kind of gravity. What if the aircraft had not vanished because of a mechanical failure? What if someone wanted what was inside it? The idea sounded extreme, but the paintings were real valuable and gone with the plane. A mid-air art theft is difficult to imagine in practical terms. You cannot simply pull over a Boeing 707 above the Pacific Unload paintings and disappear. The logistics are almost absurd. But when no wreckage is found and the cargo is unusually valuable, even unlikely ideas start to get space. A mystery does not have to make a theory likely, it only has to remove the evidence that would kill it. Some people wondered whether the aircraft had been intercepted or diverted. Others speculated about military involvement, mistaken identity, or a secret landing. Those theories required many hidden steps and many silent people, which made them hard to accept. But the official facts were so bare that speculation filled the empty places. The plane had been massive, the route was known, the disappearance was complete. The Pacific itself also worked against certainty. It is easy to say a plane vanished over the ocean, but that phrase can make the ocean sound smaller than it is. The search area was not a lake or a field. It was moving water, deep water, water that can carry light debris for miles and hide heavy wreckage forever. Even a large aircraft becomes small once it is broken and scattered across that scale. Still, search crews were not looking for the entire plane at first. They were looking for any fragment that could begin the story again. A floating panel, a crate, a piece of insulation, a strip of painted metal with an airline color on it. One object could have turned the case from a disappearance into an accident investigation. One object could have given families and investigators a point on a map, but nothing came back. As the years passed, Flight 967 became one of the aviation cases that sits in a strange category. It was not forgotten, but it did not have enough physical evidence to keep moving forward. Without wreckage, there was no final mechanical report. Without bodies, there were no recovered injuries to analyze. Without a cargo trail, there was no proof of theft. The case remained suspended after that last routine radio contact. Captain Gilberto Araujo da Silva and his crew became names attached to a route that never completed. Their final half hour could be described only in outline. They took off, they climbed, they communicated. Then something happened that stopped a Boeing cargo jet from continuing, stopped 6 men from returning home, and removed 153 paintings from the world at the same time. The paintings added a strange human detail to the loss. Art is meant to survive hands, homes, and sometimes generations. It is made carefully, packed carefully, and valued because it carries the trace of the person who created it. In this case, the canvases became part of the missing wreckage. They were not burned in a known fire or stolen in a known robbery. They vanished into the same silence as the aircraft. For investigators, that meant the case had 2 losses layered together. There was the human loss of the crew, which mattered most, and there was the cultural and financial loss of the artwork, which kept feeding public fascination. The cargo made the disappearance feel planned to some people, even though planning it would have required an almost impossible chain of actions. The grounded answer may still be that Flight 967 crashed into the Pacific after a sudden catastrophic event, and the search simply failed to find the debris. That is possible. The ocean has hidden aircraft before, and it will hide them again. But what keeps this case alive is not just that the plane crashed, it is that no one can prove where, how, or even in what condition it entered the water. There is no final cockpit voice available to settle the last seconds. No recovered wreckage to show whether the aircraft broke apart, burned, exploded, or descended intact. No piece of cargo washed ashore with a shipping label. No painting appeared later in a private room and proved the theft theory. Every major explanation remains incomplete. Today, Varg Flight 967 is still unrecovered. The 6 crew members are presumed dead, the Boeing 707 has never been found, and the paintings by Manabu Mabe remain missing. The case is remembered not because many facts are known, but because the known facts stop so abruptly. The clearest image is still the one at the beginning. A cargo jet on the ground at Narita Cruise, loading freight under airport lights, valuable paintings resting in the dark hold, and 6 men preparing for a long flight home. 30 minutes later, the aircraft was over the Pacific. Then the radio went quiet, the searchers found only open water, and a massive machine carrying art, fuel, metal, and human lives disappeared without leaving even a confirmed stain on the sea. At first light, on November 2nd, 1975, the beach at Ostia looked almost empty. It was not the clean postcard version of the Italian coast. This part of the shoreline near Rome was muddy, flat, and rough around the edges, with tire tracks pressed into the damp ground and the cold gray light making everything look unfinished. A silver Alfa Romeo was sitting unevenly near the beach. It looked out of place there, not because cars never came through that area, but because this one had the feel of something abandoned in a hurry. The tires were dirty, the ground around it was marked, and nearby in the mud, there was a man's body lying so badly injured that it took time for people to understand who they were looking at. The man was Pier Paolo Pasolini. He was 53 years old, and in Italy, he was not just a filmmaker. He was a writer, a poet, a public intellectual, and one of the most controversial voices in the country. People argued about him constantly. Some admired him as brilliant and fearless. Others hated what he said, what he made, and the way he refused to stay quiet. Pasolini lived in a world where art, sex, politics, religion, and class were never far apart. He made films that disturbed polite audiences. He wrote essays that named powerful people. He moved through Rome with the awareness that his work made enemies. But he also lived a physical, ordinary life, with restaurants, streets, editors, actors, late nights, and a car he drove himself. The Alfa Romeo near the beach belonged to him. That detail immediately gave the scene a closed feeling. The car was there, the body was there, the place was isolated enough for violence to happen without a crowd forming around it. And at first, the simplest explanation was that Pasolini had met someone, gone to the beach, and been killed after that private meeting turned violent. The police soon had a suspect. A 17-year-old street hustler named Pino Pelosi was arrested while driving Pasolini's stolen Alfa Romeo. That fact seemed to make the case move quickly. Pelosi had the car, Pasolini was dead, the two had crossed paths. In an investigation under pressure, those pieces can look like a straight line. Pelosi confessed. He said a sexual encounter had gone wrong. According to that version, Pasolini had taken him to the desolate beach. Something had shifted, violence broke out, and Pelosi killed him. It was a story that fit what many people were already willing to believe about Pasolini. It made the murder private, sordid, and contained inside one night with one young man. For the authorities, that explanation had advantages. It did not require a larger conspiracy. It did not require uncomfortable questions about politics, organized crime, or powerful enemies. It took one of Italy's loudest and most difficult intellectuals and reduced his death to a brutal encounter at the edge of Rome. A messy case, but still a manageable one. But the beach did not fully agree with the confession. Pasolini had not only been beaten, his body had been run over repeatedly by his own car. The injuries were extreme, spread across his face, head, and body. The violence looked less like a sudden fight between two people and more like an attack that continued after the victim was already helpless. It had the feel of punishment, not panic. There were also questions about Pelosi himself. If a teenage boy had fought Pasolini alone, beaten him, controlled him, and then run him over in the mud, investigators and doctors would expect signs of that struggle on Pelosi's body. Defensive wounds, clear injuries, evidence that Pasolini had fought back against him. But the physical evidence did not sit comfortably beside that version. That did not mean Pelosi was innocent of everything. He had been found with the car, he had confessed, he was part of the story. But the question became whether he was the whole story. And with Pasolini, that question mattered because his life had been lived in conflict with people who had far more to lose than a teenager on the street. In the years before his death, Pasolini had been writing and speaking about corruption in Italy. He was interested in the connections between business, politics, state power, and violence. He had criticized the country's ruling class and suggested that certain public truths were being hidden behind official language. He was not a quiet artist making private work, he was a public threat to reputations. The normal explanation was that his death had nothing to do with that. A famous man had gone out at night and encountered the wrong person. That happens. Not every controversial figure is killed for what they know. Sometimes a violent death is exactly as small and ugly as it first appears, but then the details around Pasolini kept widening instead of closing. Italian journalists and independent investigators began asking why the scene looked so large for one attacker. They looked at the injuries, the movement of the car, the condition of the body, and the lack of a clear match between Pelosi's confession and the physical work required to do all of it alone. The more they looked, the less the official story seemed to explain. One theory was that Pelosi had been used as a convenient person to hold the blame. He was young, vulnerable, and already connected to the kind of street life that allowed the public to stop asking questions. If he said he did it, many people would accept it. If he later changed his story, people could dismiss him as unreliable. That made him useful either way. For decades, the official version remained in place, but it never settled the case in the minds of many Italians. Pasolini's murder became one of those deaths with two lives. In court and paperwork, it had an answer. In public memory, it stayed open because the answer seemed too narrow for the wound it was trying to cover. The scene itself kept returning in descriptions. The empty stretch of Ostia, the mud, the car, the body damaged beyond the clean language of an official file. It was hard to separate the physical brutality from Pasolini's public life. The place where he died looked like somewhere chosen not only to kill a man, but to erase dignity from the body afterward. Years passed. The teenager who had confessed became an adult. The country changed around the case, but the doubts stayed. People continued to write about Pasolini as if his death had not been solved at all. Some believed political extremists were involved. Others pointed toward mafia figures or people connected to the corrupt systems Pasolini had been circling in his work. Then, decades after the murder, Pelosi withdrew his confession. He said he had not acted alone, he claimed that others had been present, and that his original statement had been forced by threats against his family. By then, the confession that had once helped close the case became another reason to question it. A recanted confession does not automatically reveal the truth. People can lie at the beginning and lie again later, memories shift, motives change. But Pelosi's reversal mattered because it matched what critics of the official story had been saying for years, that the violence at Ostia looked too coordinated, too excessive, and too physically difficult for one teenage suspect acting alone. The problem was that time had already done its own damage. Witnesses aged, evidence degraded, people connected to the case died or disappeared from reach. A murder investigation is hardest when the first answer becomes the official answer too quickly. Once a state, a court, and a public record begin moving in one direction, every later question has to fight the weight of that original decision. Pasolini was gone, but the things he had been writing about did not disappear. Italy in the 1970s was full of political tension, covert violence, ideological conflict, and corruption. In that atmosphere, the idea of a staged or protected killing did not seem impossible to those who already distrusted the official version. It seemed like one more locked room inside a much larger building. Still, no final architect was proven, no clean chain of command was established in court, no hidden file arrived that named the men who may have stood on the beach with Pelosi. What remained were contradictions, forensic doubts, a confession that no longer held its original shape, and a dead man whose enemies were numerous enough to make certainty difficult. The case is officially tied to Pelosi, but the wider truth remains disputed. That is why Pasolini's death continues to trouble people. It is not only that a famous director was murdered, it is that the explanation offered for his murder seems smaller than the evidence, smaller than the violence, and smaller than the life of the man who was killed. In the end, the official story gave Italy a culprit, but not necessarily peace. Pelosi was the name attached to the crime. The beach was the place where the body was found. The Alfa Romeo was the object that connected the victim and the suspect. But the questions around who else was there, who wanted Pasolini silent and why the attack looked the way it did never fully went away. The last image is still the same one people saw that morning in Ostia, a silver Alfa Romeo sitting crooked in the mud, a cold beach near Rome, a body damaged so badly it seemed to carry more than one man's rage. And beyond it, a country already prepared to accept the simplest answer while the physical scene quietly kept pointing past the teenager who said he had done it alone. Late on the night of November 12, 1976, a driver on the A9 highway near Inverness saw fire in the darkness ahead. It was not the soft orange of a house window or the red blink of a roadside signal. It was bigger than that, low to the ground burning in a lonely lay-by beside the road, with smoke folding into the cold highland air. As the driver got closer, the shape became clear. It was a car. A powder blue BMW, expensive looking even through the flames, sitting off the road as if someone had pulled in and then lost all control of the night. There were no people standing nearby waving for help. No woman on the shoulder, no child crying behind the barrier, just the car burning hard against the black countryside. At first, it could have been an accident. Cars catch fire, engines fail, people pull over when something smells wrong, and sometimes flames take the whole vehicle before anyone can explain what happened. On a dark Scottish road with the wind moving across the open land, that explanation was simple enough to reach for. But then, people began looking for the driver. The car belonged to 36-year-old Renee McCrae. She was known in Inverness as glamorous, social, and easy to notice. She was separated from her husband Gordon McCrae, a wealthy building businessman, and she lived a life that looked polished from the outside. She had nice clothes, a nice car, and the sort of presence that made people remember seeing her. That night, Renee had her 3-year-old son Andrew with her. She had told people she was taking him away for the weekend to visit her sister. The plan sounded ordinary. A mother loading a small child into the car, driving south, spending time with family. There was nothing in that story that would make anyone follow her or warn her or stand in the driveway and tell her not to go. But Renee was not really going to see her sister. She was driving toward a private arrangement, one that had been kept behind the front-facing version of her life. She was going to meet Bill McDowell, a married man she had been involved with. He was not just a casual name in the background, he was the man connected to the secret plan Renee thought was waiting for her. Renee believed she was moving toward a different future. She had been having an affair with Bill, and by that point, the relationship had crossed from private meetings into expectations. There were things to discuss, consequences to face, and a life that could not stay hidden forever. On the surface, she was a mother going on a family visit. Underneath the road was carrying her towards something much more complicated. When the BMW was found, burning the lie about the sister's visit began to matter. A false destination does not prove a crime by itself. People lie about private relationships all the time. They protect themselves from gossip, family pressure, or embarrassment. But when a woman and her small son vanish, and the car she was driving is found on fire in a remote lay-by, every hidden detail becomes part of the map. Investigators examined what was left of the vehicle. The fire had damaged the car badly, but it had not erased everything. In the trunk, they found heavy blood staining. That discovery changed the case. It was no longer possible to think only about a mechanical fire or a simple roadside emergency. Blood in the trunk meant violence had happened somewhere in the chain of events. Renee and Andrew were gone. Not injured at the roadside, not found nearby, not taken to a hospital, gone completely. Searchers began looking across the highlands through places where a body could be hidden and not found for years. The landscape was beautiful in daylight, but for investigators, it became a problem of scale. Roads, woods, water quarries, fields, and empty ground stretched in every direction. The first hours after a disappearance are important because people are still close to their last movements. Cars can be remembered, witnesses can be found. A person who saw headlights in the wrong place might still be awake to say so. But the highlands do not give up every movement made at night. A car can turn off, a person can step into darkness, a small child can vanish with no voice left behind. Bill McDowell became central to the investigation because he was central to Renee's hidden life. He had a motive investigators could understand. If Renee expected a future with him, then his marriage, reputation, and financial responsibilities were all under pressure. A secret affair can remain manageable when it is only secret. It becomes something else when the other person wants it recognized. The normal explanation from his side was that he had nothing to do with what happened. Suspicion is not proof, and investigators needed more than motive. They needed bodies, a confession, a witness, or physical evidence strong enough to survive in court. In 1976, without modern forensic tools, and without Renee or Andrew recovered, the case was difficult to carry all the way to conviction. So, the years began to pass. Renee McCrae and Andrew remained missing. Their names stayed attached to the A9, to the burning BMW, and to the question of where a mother and a little boy could have been taken. Police searched quarries, they followed tips, they returned to old ground with new methods. Each search gave families and the public a small rise of hope, and then, most of the time, nothing. The case became one of Scotland's longest-running missing persons mysteries. That phrase can sound neat, but inside it is a long, grinding failure to find the thing everyone is looking for. Decades of birthdays passed without Andrew. Renee's family aged. Witnesses aged. Detectives retired. The road changed, the country changed, but the central fact stayed fixed. Their bodies were still missing. A missing adult can leave room for wild theories, but Andrew's age made those theories harder to hold. He was 3 years old. He was with his mother. He could not start a new life, hide his identity, or disappear by choice. If Renee had been harmed, then Andrew had almost certainly been harmed, because he was there because he saw something, or simply because the killer could not leave him alive. That is one reason the case stayed painful in public memory. The burning car was dramatic, but the child made the silence worse. People could picture the small practical details: a little boy in the car, a mother making sure he was settled. The ordinary work of traveling with a child at night. And then that image stopped at the lay-by with the BMW on fire and no child anywhere near it. Investigators kept returning to Bill McDowell. Over time, the theory hardened around him. The belief was that Renee was not killed by a stranger on the road and that the burning car was not random. It was staged to destroy evidence and confuse the timeline. The person responsible knew enough about Renee's private plans to intercept her and had enough to lose if those plans became public. Still, belief is not a conviction. For years, McDowell remained free. The case sat in that frustrating space where many people thought they knew who had done it, but the legal system had not yet reached the same conclusion. That gap can be brutal for families. It means seeing a name, hearing a name, and still having no official ending. Then, decades after the BMW burned on the A9, a cold case review brought the evidence back into focus. By then, investigative methods had changed. The old assumptions could be tested against old statements. Timelines could be rebuilt, witnesses could be re-examined. The question was whether a case without bodies could still be strong enough to bring into court. In 2022, Bill McDowell went on trial. He was 80 years old. Almost 46 years had passed since Renee and Andrew disappeared. The courtroom did not have the bodies of the victims, and that absence was still the center of the case. But prosecutors argued that McDowell had killed them to protect himself from the consequences of the affair and the responsibilities that were closing in on him. The trial forced the old night back into the present. The burning BMW, the blood in the trunk, the false trip to the sister, the secret relationship, and the missing bodies all had to be laid out again. This time, not as rumor or local memory, but as evidence. The past had to be made clear enough for a jury to decide what happened on a dark road in 1976. McDowell was convicted of murdering Renee McCrae and her son Andrew. The verdict gave the case an answer that had been missing for nearly half a century. It said the man tied to Renee's secret life was also the man responsible for ending it. But even that answer did not give the family everything. Bill McDowell died in prison only months later. He never revealed where Renee and Andrew were buried. That final refusal kept one part of the case open even after the conviction. The law had named the killer, but the land still held the victims. Somewhere, the mother and child remained hidden exactly as they had been since the night the BMW burned. That is what makes the ending feel unfinished, even though the case was solved in court. A conviction can establish truth, but it cannot replace a grave. It cannot recover the small bones of a 3-year-old boy or the remains of the woman who drove into the dark believing she was moving toward a new life. It cannot answer every practical question the family had lived with for decades. The A9 lay-by became the first scene everyone remembered because fire demands attention. Flames in the dark, a blue BMW burning beside the road, smoke rising into Highland air. But the real shape of the case was not only the fire, it was the space after it, the empty seats, the blood in the trunk, and the silence that lasted 46 years. In the end, Renee McRae had not gone to visit her sister. She had not run away with Andrew. She had not vanished into a private future. She had driven into a meeting, connected to a man who wanted his own life protected more than he wanted hers preserved. And when the truth finally reached a courtroom, the only thing missing was the one thing her family still needed most. The last image remains that cold stretch of Scottish Road in November. A car burning where it should not have been, a mother and child already gone from view. And somewhere beyond the headlights, beyond the searches and the drained quarries and the decades of waiting, the place Bill McDowell took them and refused to name before he died. On the morning of February 28, 1980, the street outside the Lin family home in Taipei did not look abandoned. People passed through the area. Cars moved along the road, and somewhere close by, plainclothes security officers were watching the house because the man who lived there was not an ordinary private citizen anymore. He had become a problem for the state. Inside the home, the day had the shape of normal family life. There were rooms with furniture, children's things, telephone dishes, doors opening and closing, and the kind of household noise that never feels important until someone later tries to reconstruct the last safe hour. A grandmother was there. Children were there. The house was supposed to be protected by the simple fact that it was never really alone. The man at the center of that surveillance was Lin Yisheng, a prominent figure in Taiwan's pro-democracy movement. By then, he was not at home with his family. He was in prison after a political crackdown that had swept up opposition leaders and activists. The state had taken him away, but it had not stopped watching the people connected to him. That was the strange logic of the house. Lin himself was behind bars, but his family home remained under attention. The security presence outside could be explained as political monitoring. It could also be explained as intimidation. Either way, it meant the family's private life had become part of a larger conflict. The house was a home, but it was also an object being watched. For the people inside, that kind of surveillance may have become routine in the worst possible way. A watched street can still have laundry meals, children moving between rooms, and an old woman answering ordinary questions. Human beings adjust to pressure when it stays long enough. They begin living around it, stepping over the strange parts because there is still breakfast, still schoolwork, still the next small thing to do. The grandmother in the home was Lin Chun-Chu, 60 years old. She was there with her granddaughters, including 7-year-old twins. Children that age do not understand state power in the way adults do. They understand rooms, voices, rules, favorite objects, and whether the adults around them seem tense. They understand the front door and the sound of the phone. They do not understand why men outside might be watching. At first, if someone had asked whether the family was safe, the easy answer would have been yes. Not emotionally safe, not politically safe, but physically safe in the narrowest sense. The house was known to the authorities. It was being observed. Any stranger approaching it should have been noticed. Any unusual movement should have created a reaction. But sometime that day, an attacker entered the Lin family home. That is the part of the case that never becomes easier to understand. A person got inside a house that was supposedly under constant attention. They moved through the rooms in daylight. They reached a grandmother and children. And the people outside, the ones who were supposed to be watching, did not stop it before it happened. The normal explanation would be that surveillance is never perfect. A watcher can look away, a shift can change, a person can enter through a blind spot or be mistaken for someone allowed to visit. Human systems fail all the time. But this was not a random house on a quiet road. This was the home of an imprisoned opposition leader in a tense political moment, and that made every failure look less like carelessness and more like a question. Inside, the attacker used a knife. Lin Chunchu was stabbed to death. The twin girls were stabbed to death as well. Another daughter, the eldest, was badly wounded but survived. The attack was direct, close, and personal in its physical reality, even if the motive behind it belonged to something much larger than the room. There are crimes where distance protects the killer from the victim's humanity. A gun fired from across a street, a bomb placed and left behind. This was not like that. The person who attacked the Lin family had to be close enough to see faces, close enough to feel movement, close enough to know they were attacking a grandmother and children. The violence was not abstract inside that house. Afterward, there was silence of a specific kind. Not peaceful silence, but the gap after sudden violence when the ordinary world has not caught up yet. Objects remain where they were. A telephone might hang in the same place. Shoes remain by a door. The street outside still has traffic. The watchers outside still occupy the same city. But inside the rooms, the family has been broken. When the attack became known, the central question was immediate. How did this happen under surveillance? If the state had officers watching the home, how did a killer enter, attack multiple people, and leave without being stopped? That question did not require a political opinion. It came directly from the physical layout of the case. The government denied responsibility. Officials said they did not know who the killer was. They suggested the attack could have been carried out by rogue extremists or someone outside state control. On paper, that explanation gave the authorities distance from the blood inside the house. It treated the murders as an outside crime that had happened despite state monitoring, not because of it. But for Taiwan's democratic opposition and for many observers beyond Taiwan, that explanation did not hold. Lin Yisheng was a prominent dissident. He was in prison, his family was being watched. Then his mother and daughters were murdered in broad daylight. The sequence looked too precise, too useful as a warning, and too difficult for an outsider to carry out undetected. The attack also carried a message whether or not anyone wrote one down. A dissident in prison cannot protect his family. A watched house is not necessarily a safe house. The people with power can claim ignorance even when their own surveillance surrounds the scene. That is what made the case more than a murder investigation. It became a statement about fear control and the limits of truth under a political system built to hide itself. Lin Yisheng had to learn what happened from a position of helplessness. He could not have been there to close a door, answer a sound, or stand between his family and the person with the knife. He was locked away because of politics, and while he was locked away, violence reached the people closest to him. That fact gave the murders a cruelty beyond the physical attack. The surviving daughter became one of the only living witnesses to the inside of the event, but survival did not solve the case. A child wounded in an attack can carry fragments, not a complete courtroom answer. Trauma does not arrange itself neatly for investigators. It leaves images, pain, confusion, and sometimes names that cannot be proven against the machinery around them. The investigation did not produce a clear, trusted resolution. No final perpetrator was established in a way that satisfied the central contradiction. The state's position remained that it had no role in the killings. The opposition's suspicion remained that the murders were tied directly to the political pressure around Lin and the broader pro-democracy movement. Over time, the Lin family massacre became part of Taiwan's historical memory. It was not only remembered as the killing of 3 people inside a home, it was remembered as a moment when private family space and state intimidation seemed to collapse into one another. A grandmother and 2 children became names inside a national argument about power. The date mattered too. February 28th already carried heavy political meaning in Taiwan because of earlier state violence remembered through the February 28th incident. For an attack like this to happen on that date gave the murders an added historical weight. Whether chosen deliberately or not, the timing pressed the family's private loss into the country's public wound. For people outside Taiwan, the case can be difficult to hold because it does not move like a standard murder story. There is no clean suspect introduced in the first act, no piece of DNA found in the final act, no arrest scene that lets the listener exhale. Instead, the mystery sits around a contradiction. The house was watched, the killer was not stopped. The people who watched claimed not to know. That contradiction is why the case lasts. A random killer entering a home is already violent, but a killer entering a politically surveilled home and leaving behind a dead grandmother and dead children creates a different kind of damage. It attacks the idea that observation means protection. It suggests that being watched can make a family more vulnerable, not less. The official absence of answers also protected the deeper fear. If the state did it, the killer would almost certainly never be named by the state. If the state did not do it, then its surveillance was so useless that a protected target's family could be slaughtered in daylight while watchers failed to see what mattered most. Neither version gives comfort. And so the murders remained unresolved. Lin Chunchu and the twin girls were dead. The eldest daughter survived. Lin Yisheng remained a father and son marked by a loss that had happened while he was locked away. The people who wanted democracy in Taiwan saw the attack as proof of how far intimidation could reach. The government's denial did not erase that belief. Years later, when Taiwan's political system changed and the country began looking back at the authoritarian period with more honesty, the Lin family massacre still stood as one of the most painful unanswered cases. It belonged to history, but it did not feel safely historical. It was too domestic, too close, too centered on children in their own home. The final image is not a public square or a prison cell. It is a quiet house in Taipei on a day when people outside were supposed to be watching. Inside, ordinary family objects sat in ordinary rooms. Outside, the state's eyes were nearby. And between those two facts, someone entered with a knife, killed a grandmother and two 7-year-old girls, and left behind a question Taiwan has never fully been able to put down. On July 22, 1975, the heat over Paratus, Andalusia did not feel like weather as much as pressure. It sat on the wheat fields, on the white walls, on the dirt roads, and on the men and women working across the Cortijo Los Galindos estate. By afternoon, even the insects seemed quieter, and the air above the land trembled in the sun. Los Galindos was a large agricultural estate, the kind of place where people could be close enough to share work, but far enough apart to miss what was happening on the other side of a building. There were fields, barns, farm tools, tractors, storage areas, and long stretches of open ground. It looked exposed, but in a place that large, a person could still be alone. The people there that day were not strangers passing through. They were tied to the estate by work routine and the small hierarchy of rural life. There was an estate manager, his wife, a tractor driver, and another couple connected to the labor on the property. They knew the rhythms of the land, they knew when machines started, when meals were taken, and who usually moved through which part of the estate. At first, nothing about the day needed a dark explanation. Farm work is full of hard sounds, metal hits metal, engines cough, doors slam, people shout across distance because the wind and machinery swallow normal voices. If someone heard a sudden noise, the easy answer was that a tool had dropped, a tractor had misfired, or someone had yelled about work. But then, smoke appeared. A tractor was burning in the field. Flames climbed through the machine and sent dark smoke into the bright afternoon sky. From a distance, a tractor fire could still be explained as an accident. Engines overheat, fuel leaks. Dry fields catch quickly in July. In Andalusia, fire was not impossible. It was the kind of thing people would run toward because a burning machine could spread into the wheat and ruin more than one day's work. But the fire was not the real beginning of the emergency. It was a cover or an attempt at one. As people began to understand what had happened at Los Galindos, the burning tractor became only one piece of a scene that was already far beyond an accident. Bodies were found across the estate, not together, not in a single room, and not in a way that made the sequence easy to read. The victims had been attacked with the kinds of things already present on a farm: heavy tools, implements meant for work turned into weapons. That detail gave the violence a practical, ugly closeness. The killer did not need to bring the countryside into the crime. The countryside was already there, lying on workbenches, leaning against walls, resting beside machines. 5 people were dead. They had been beaten and burned, and the attempts to destroy evidence made the estate feel less like the scene of a sudden argument and more like a place someone had tried to erase in pieces. Hay was used, fire was used. The tractor became part of the destruction, but the efforts were frantic, uneven, and not clean enough to hide the scale of what had happened. The first normal explanation was a dispute that had gotten out of control. Rural estates are not peaceful just because they are quiet. Money, land, labor, pride, stolen crops, unpaid debts, and family resentments can sit under the surface for years. A fight over wheat or work could begin with voices and end with a weapon close at hand. But that theory had a problem. One angry person losing control might kill once, maybe twice, if the second person intervened. But 5 people across a working estate in broad daylight was different. It required movement, timing, opportunity, and control. The killer or killers had to reach each victim, attack them, and then attempt to burn or conceal what had been done. The estate itself became part of the puzzle. Los Galindos was open enough that violence should have risked being seen, but separated enough that one scream in the wrong place might not carry. A person could be attacked near one building while someone else was working near another. The sun, the machinery, and the layout could all create little pockets of isolation. Investigators had to ask whether the victims were killed in one burst of violence or in a sequence. Did one person witness the first attack and then get silenced? Did the killer move through the estate because each new victim became a problem? Or had the victims been gathered, trapped, or controlled by more than one person before the killing began? The burning of the bodies in the tractor suggested panic, but it also suggested knowledge. Someone understood that physical evidence mattered even if they did not destroy it perfectly. Fire can erase blood patterns, fingerprints, fibers, and the smaller details that tell investigators who moved where. In 1975, forensic limitations already made a rural crime scene difficult. Fire made it worse. The Civil Guard and investigators faced a scene that had been damaged before they could fully read it. Heat, smoke, fire, disturbed ground, and the practical chaos of a farm all worked against them. A city apartment can preserve a crime scene behind one locked door. A farm in summer does not behave that way. It has dust, animals, equipment, fuel, and people arriving after the fact because smoke can be seen from far away. As the investigation widened, theories began to form around the estate's social structure. Los Galindos was not just a workplace, it was part of a rural world where wealthy landowners often lived away from the land while workers and managers handled the daily reality. That distance can create resentment in both directions. The people who own the property and the people who survive on it do not always see the same estate. One theory pointed towards stolen wheat. A dispute over missing crops could have created a confrontation between workers, managers, or people outside the estate. Wheat may sound small from far away, but in a rural economy, stolen grain can mean money accusation, humiliation, and punishment. A practical theft can become personal very quickly when everyone knows everyone. Another theory moved higher. Some believed the murders may have been tied to a financial cover-up involving the absentee owners or people close to them. That version made the crime feel less like an argument and more like a cleanup. If someone had discovered something they should not have known or threatened to speak, then the killings might have been meant to seal the estate shut. But the more people looked at the facts, the more the logistics resisted a simple answer. 5 victims meant 5 separate acts of violence, 5 opportunities for something to go wrong, 5 chances for someone to run, hide, shout, or fight back. If one killer did all of it alone, that person needed either extraordinary luck, extraordinary familiarity with the estate, or both. That is why many people came to believe more than one person was involved. An organized hit would explain the ability to control multiple victims and move through the property quickly. It would also explain why the attempts to burn evidence seemed like part of a broader effort to hide not just a killer, but a motive that pointed outside the immediate violence. Still, an organized hit requires its own evidence. Who ordered it? Who carried it out? How did they enter and leave? Why kill everyone there instead of only one target? In rural communities, answers often depend on people talking. But in Paratus, silence became one of the strongest features of the case. Some silences come from fear, some come from loyalty, some come from knowing that if powerful people are involved, the safest thing is to remember nothing clearly. After the murders, the local farming community carried the story like a weight, but not necessarily like a confession. People had theories, people heard things, but theories do not put names in a court file. Los Galindos became the kind of case where every explanation sounded possible until it had to account for all 5 bodies. A crop dispute explained anger, but not the scale. A lone killer explained sudden violence, but not the control. A financial cover-up explained motive, but required proof that never fully surfaced. The burned tractor explained destruction, but not the beginning. The date also mattered. 1975 was a year of transition and tension in Spain, with old structures still present and new uncertainties close behind. In rural Andalusia, power did not always move through official channels. Land money, family names, and local silence could shape what was possible. A murder investigation on paper was one thing. A murder investigation inside a tight rural world was another. The victims' final movements were never turned into a clean, universally accepted timeline. That is part of why the case has lasted so long. To solve a mass killing, investigators need sequence. Who died first? Who saw what? Who had time to react? Who was the true target? At Los Galindos, the damage scene left too much room between those questions. The fire may have destroyed more than evidence. It may have destroyed the one detail that would have separated a chaotic rage killing from a planned operation. A footprint near a body, a trace on a tool, a pattern of blood that showed direction, a small mark that showed whether a victim was moved before or after death. In a case this tangled one, small physical fact can matter more than 100 rumors. As the years went by, the murders hardened into rural legend. People still spoke of the estate, the heat, the burning tractor, and the bodies found in different places across the property. But the legal path narrowed. Leads faded. Witnesses aged. Memories blurred or stayed deliberately quiet. The case remained open in memory long after it stopped moving forward in court. Eventually, the statute of limitations expired. That meant, even if a clear suspect emerged later, the old legal machinery could no longer do what the victims' families needed it to do. The case had passed from investigation into history without becoming justice. 5 people had been killed in broad daylight, and the final answer remained beyond reach. That is the part of Los Galindos that feels most difficult to set down. It was not a disappearance in the ocean or a body found without a name. The victims were there, the estate was there, the tools, fire tractor fields, and buildings were all there. The scene was physical and immediate. And still, the truth slipped into the spaces between people who would not or could not say enough. Today, the Los Galindos murders remain unsolved. The main theories still circle the same ground: stolen wheat, labor conflict, hidden money, absentee power, or an organized killing disguised by fire and rural confusion. None of them has fully closed the case. None of them has given the 5 dead a complete account of why they were killed. The final image is the one that rose above the estate that afternoon. A heavy tractor burning under the Andalusian sun smoke, lifting over wheat fields that should have held only work and heat. Around it, scattered across the property, were the bodies of people who had started the day inside a normal rural routine. And somewhere beyond the smoke, someone knew why the killing began, then let the silence do the rest. On the morning of October 30th, 1979, someone moving through the forest of Rambouillet came across a small pond called Etang Rompu. The water was dark, shallow, and still, with leaves gathered along the edges and mud underneath. It was the kind of place a person could pass without stopping unless something in the water made them look twice. There was a man lying face down in the pond. His clothes were not the clothes of someone who had wandered there without purpose. He was dressed like a government official, like a man who belonged in offices, cars, meetings, and polished hallways. The water around him was less than 2 feet deep, not a lake, not a river, not a place where a healthy adult should vanish beneath the surface. The man was Robert Boulin, 59 years old, France's Minister of Labor. He was not a minor figure in the government. He was respected, experienced, and widely discussed as someone who could rise even higher, possibly to become prime minister. In public life, he had the image of a serious political servant, the sort of man whose movements mattered to newspapers and rivals alike. In the weeks before his death, Boulin had been under pressure. A real estate scandal had been pushed into public view, and his name was being dragged through a damaging political fight. To outsiders, that gave the first explanation its shape: a powerful man caught in a scandal, a reputation under attack, a final drive into a forest, a body found in water. Suicide was the conclusion that came quickly. French authorities moved in that direction almost immediately. The official account said Boulin had taken barbiturates and drowned himself in the pond. It was a clean enough explanation on paper. A scandal had cornered him, the drugs had weakened him, and the shallow water had finished what he intended to do. The case could be placed into the category of political disgrace ending in private despair. But the physical scene resisted that neatness. The pond was too shallow for people to stop asking questions. A person can drown in very little water under certain conditions. That is true. Drugs can make a person unconscious. That is also true. But when the dead man is a senior minister and the water barely rises above the knees, every small injury and every missing object becomes important. Boulin's family did not accept the official explanation. Neither did independent journalists who later examined the case. They pointed first to his face. He had severe facial injuries that appeared to have happened before he entered the water. That mattered because injuries before drowning suggest an event that is not simply a man lying down to die by his own decision. The normal explanation was that he could have fallen. A person under the influence of barbiturates can stumble, strike their face, and end up in water. A forest has roots, stones, banks, and uneven ground. But then came the other details. His lungs reportedly showed minimal signs that drowning had been the clear central mechanism in the way officials described. The body did not read as simply as the report did. There were also files missing from his car. Sensitive political documents he was believed to be carrying were not where they should have been. A suicide can leave papers behind in disorder, but missing files open a second door. If Boulin was only a man taking his own life, why would politically sensitive material disappear around the same time? That question changed the atmosphere of the case. The forest was no longer just a lonely place where a minister had ended his life. It became a possible drop point, a meeting place, or a location chosen because it was quiet enough for something else to happen. The pond became less like the cause of death and more like the final stage of a scene arranged for discovery. In Paris, politics continued moving. Governments do not pause for one dead man, even a senior one. Statements are made, offices are filled, newspapers print one version and then another. But for Boulin's family, the official conclusion created a second injury. They were not only grieving him, they were being asked to accept that the broken face, the shallow water, and the missing files were all part of a suicide that required no deeper investigation. The timing also mattered. Boulin was not just under public attack, he was positioned inside a political world where rivalries were intense and reputations could decide careers. He was seen as a possible future prime minister, which meant his rise would have threatened other ambitions. In politics, a scandal can be a weapon long before a court decides whether it is fair. The smear campaign around the real estate matter had damaged him, but some people believed it had also been designed to isolate him. If a public figure is made to look corrupt or unstable before he dies, then his death becomes easier to explain afterward. People hear scandal, then suicide, and the mind connects the two without demanding every physical detail. That is why the injuries became so important. A narrative can move smoothly in a newspaper, but a body is less cooperative. Bruises, fractures, water in the lungs, the position of clothing, and the condition of a car all tell their own version. In Boulan's case, the version told by the body seemed to keep interrupting the one told by the state. Journalists returned to the pond, the timeline, and the official files. They asked why the investigation had moved so fast towards suicide. They asked whether evidence had been ignored, mishandled, or kept from public view. They asked who benefited from Boulan being removed from the political field. None of those questions alone proved murder, but together they made the official answer feel incomplete. The government's position did not collapse. The death remained officially classified as suicide. That classification carries force. It shapes how agencies treat documents, how courts approach appeals, and how the public remembers a case. Once suicide is written into the structure of an investigation, changing it requires more than doubt. It requires proof strong enough to move institutions that may not want to move. Boulan's family kept pushing anyway. They argued that he had been assassinated, or at least that his death had been staged to look self-inflicted. They pointed to the facial trauma, the shallow water, the weak drowning indicators, and the missing political files. They wanted the case reopened in a meaningful way, not just revisited as a historical argument. But the case remained trapped between two kinds of power. One was evidentiary power, the need for clear, testable facts. The other was political power, the ability of a state to decide what it will release, what it will classify, and what it will treat as settled. In cases involving senior officials, those two forces can press against each other for decades. The forest of Rambouillet added its own quiet weight. It was an ancient royal forest, a place associated with Old France official retreats and the controlled beauty of state landscapes. That setting made Boulan's death feel even more layered. A modern minister found in old woods face down in a small pond, while files connected to modern political life were gone. The practical questions never went away. How did he get to the pond? Was he alone? What happened before he entered the water? Were the injuries caused by a fall, an assault, or something staged afterward? Who last saw the documents? Why was the conclusion reached so quickly? A. Solved. Case usually narrows over time. Boulan's seemed to keep widening. For people who accepted suicide, the case was tragic but not mysterious. A man under pressure took drugs, went to a secluded place, and died. There are painful precedents for that. Political careers can break people. Public humiliation can distort judgment. No conspiracy is needed for despair to become fatal. But for those who rejected the official version, the suicide explanation depended on ignoring too many physical facts. They saw a man with injuries, shallow water, missing files, and enemies inside a system capable of protecting itself. In that reading, Boulan's death was not the end of a scandal. It was part of one. The hardest part is that both sides begin with real elements. He was under pressure. He was found dead in water. Barbiturates were part of the official account. But he also had injuries that raised serious questions, and important documents were missing. The case turns on whether those contradictions are unfortunate details around a suicide or evidence that the suicide story was built too quickly. Decades later, the death of Robert Boulan remains one of France's most disputed political cases. It is officially a suicide, but heavily challenged by his family, journalists, and others who believe the evidence points toward a cover-up. The repeated efforts to fully reopen or declassify the matter have not produced the definitive public reckoning his supporters have demanded. So the case sits in a strange position. It has an official answer, but not a settled one. It has a body, a place, and a date, but not a version of events that everyone can trust. And because the victim was a man inside the highest circles of French power, every unanswered question seems to lead not only into the forest, but back toward the offices and rivals he left behind. The final image is still quiet. A tailored suit in muddy water. A senior minister face down in a pond too shallow to make sense at first glance. Trees around him, documents missing, and a state prepared to call it suicide before the physical details had stopped speaking. In the forest of Rambouillet, Robert Boulan was found in less than 2 feet of water. and France has been arguing over that depth ever since. A few days before Christmas in 1979, the town of Kildare, Ireland, had the familiar brightness of late December. Shop windows were lit, people were going in and out of pubs and halls, and cold air moved through the streets, carrying the sound of doors opening, cars starting, and shoes scraping over wet pavement. Phyllis Murphy was 23 years old. That night, she'd gone to a holiday dance, the kind of local event where people dressed a little better than usual, stayed out later than they planned, and stepped back into the cold, still carrying the warmth of music and conversation. There was nothing unusual about her being there. It was Christmas week, and people were trying to enjoy the small rituals of the season. After the dance, Phyllis made her way to a bus stop. It was brightly lit enough to feel public ordinary enough that no one would treat it as dangerous. A young woman waiting for a ride home after a dance was not a scene that would hold anyone's attention for long. Someone might pass her notice, her coat, maybe recognize her face, and keep walking. The first normal explanation for what happened next was delay. Buses run late, people accept lifts, friends change plans at the last minute. A person can fail to come home and still be safe for a few hours, especially during the holidays when routines bend and everyone is moving between houses, pubs, dances, and family visits. But Phyllis did not come home. As the hours passed, that ordinary explanation began to fall apart. A missed bus should lead to a call, a friend's couch, a story someone could confirm. Instead, there was only the last known place, the bus stop, after the dance. She had been there waiting in the open, and then at some point she was no longer there. The idea that someone in a vehicle had intercepted her became one of the central possibilities. It did not require a loud struggle in the street. It did not require a stranger dragging her in front of witnesses. A car can pull close to a curb. A window can roll down. A familiar face can offer a lift. In a cold Irish night before Christmas, accepting a ride would not seem reckless if the person looked safe enough. The search for Phyllis began with the kind of urgency that still has hope inside it. People looked for signs that she had gone somewhere on her own, that there had been a misunderstanding that she might be found cold and embarrassed, but alive. They checked routes, spoke to people from the dance, and tried to rebuild the hours after she was last seen. But days passed. Christmas came with her still missing. That changed the feeling of the holiday for everyone who knew her. Houses still had decorations, people still gathered around tables, but underneath it was the knowledge that a young woman who should have been home was somewhere unknown, and the person who knew where she was had said nothing. Nearly a month later, the search moved into the Wicklow Mountains. In winter, that landscape can feel removed from ordinary life. The trees stand dark and close together, the ground holds cold, sounds do not travel the same way through the forest. Under a thick canopy of spruce, searchers found Phyllis Murphy's body. She had been hidden there, away from the town, away from the bus stop, away from the lights and music of the night she disappeared. The location suggested someone wanted distance. Not just physical distance, but emotional distance too. The killer had taken her from a public place and left her in a cold mountain area where discovery depended on persistence. Phyllis had been strangled. The word is short, but the act is not. It requires closeness, time, and force. It means the person who killed her stayed near enough to feel her fighting for air. There was nothing abstract about it. Whoever had taken her from Kildare had not killed from far away and vanished in the same instant. They had been right there. The discovery turned the missing person search into a murder investigation. Detectives had to work backward from two scenes that were far apart in mood and geography. One was a festive bus stop in town, the other was a frozen place under spruce trees in the mountains. Between those 2 points was the missing journey, and inside that journey was the killer. The case triggered a major manhunt. Police looked at people who knew Phyllis, people who had attended the dance, people who had cars, people who had been seen near the bus stop, and people with histories that made investigators stop and look twice. They were trying to find the person who could move through both worlds, local enough to reach her, controlled enough to hide her. One man came into focus early. His name was John Creer. He was a former Army sergeant, and he knew Phyllis. Investigators noticed scratches on his face that did not have a comfortable explanation. Scratches on a suspect can mean many things. Work animals, an accident, a fight. But in a strangulation case, they also raise a specific possibility that the victim fought back. The normal explanation was that Crayer had an alibi and that the scratches were unrelated. Suspicion alone could not carry the case. In 1979, forensic science had limits that today can be easy to forget. Detectives could preserve blood fibers and stains, but they could not always extract the kind of identity from them that later generations would take for granted. So investigators were left in a difficult position. They had a suspect who seemed to matter, they had details that made them uneasy, they had a murdered woman whose body had been left in the mountains, but they did not have the final scientific bridge that could take a strong suspicion and turn it into proof beyond reasonable doubt. Crayer denied responsibility. His alibi gave him room to stand outside the case. Detectives could keep looking at him, but every route toward prosecution weakened when it reached the same wall. They needed something that placed him with Phyllis in the crucial window, something that did not depend only on instinct, rumor, or the interpretation of marks on his face. Still, the investigators did something that would matter years later. They preserved tiny blood samples from Phyllis's clothing. At the time, those samples could not speak clearly enough. They were small, easy to underestimate, and technologically ahead of the case only in the sense that someday the future might know what to do with them. That kind of preservation is quiet police work. It does not look dramatic. It is not an arrest, a chase, or a confession. It is a person labeling evidence, storing it properly, and refusing to throw away a small trace just because the current science cannot use it fully. In cold cases, that patience can become the difference between a file staying closed and a name finally being proved. For years, the case remained unresolved. Phyllis Murphy became part of Ireland's memory of unsolved violence, one of those names attached to a season, a place, and a question. People remembered the Christmas timing. They remembered the bus stop. They remembered the body found under spruce trees, and they remembered that the man many suspected had not been convicted. Cold cases do not stay still for the families. Even when the public moves on, the people closest to the victim keep living beside the empty place. Anniversaries return. News stories resurface. A witness dies. A detective retires. A rumor arrives and leads nowhere. Hope becomes smaller, but it does not disappear completely because the evidence still exists somewhere in a box. Then, science caught up. By 1999, DNA profiling had changed what old evidence could do. A stain that once only said blood could now say whose blood or whose biological material with a level of precision that earlier investigators had not been able to use. The preserved samples from Phyllis's clothing were tested again, and this time they were no longer silent. The DNA connected John Crayer to the evidence. That result changed the entire case. The old suspicion finally had a physical foundation. The scratches, the familiarity, the doubts about his explanations, and the detective's early instincts all came back with new weight. What had once been a case stalled by the limits of 1979 could now move forward under the science of 1999. The courtroom, years later, had to reach back across 2 decades. People had to talk about the holiday dance again, the bus stop again, the Wicklow Mountains again, and the evidence that had waited through all that time. Crayer was no longer just a man detectives had once watched closely. He was tied to the preserved traces from Phyllis's clothing. The DNA did what memory alone could not do. It survived the years without changing its story. Witnesses can forget, alibis can be polished, communities can argue themselves into confusion, but biological evidence, if preserved correctly, can remain exactly what it was on the night the crime happened. Crayer was convicted and sent to prison. For the investigators who had suspected him early, the result confirmed that their original direction had been right. But that confirmation came 20 years after Phyllis had been taken from the bus stop, which meant justice arrived with a delay so long it could never feel complete. The conviction did not undo the Christmas her family lost in 1979. It did not erase the month of searching the discovery in the mountains or the years when the man responsible was still outside prison, but it did give the case an ending grounded in proof. It showed that the evidence had been waiting, not forgotten. Phyllis Murphy's murder became one of those cases where the past was solved by the future. The detectives in 1979 did not have the tools they needed, but they had enough discipline to protect what the future might need. The small samples on her clothing became a bridge across 20 years. Today, the case stands as a cold case solved by DNA, but its emotional shape remains fixed in that first scene. A young woman leaving a holiday dance in Kildare. A bus stop in the cold. A vehicle close enough to change everything. And somewhere in that brief movement between public light and private danger, John Carrar crossed into Phyllis Murphy's life and ended it. The final image is not the courtroom, it is the Wicklow Mountains in winter spruce branches holding the cold above the ground and Phyllis hidden where her killer hoped time and weather would do the rest. But a few traces stayed on her clothing, small enough to miss, strong enough to wait, and 20 years later, they spoke the name investigators had been carrying all along. In late August of 1978, 3 men checked into a luxury hotel in Tripoli, Libya. Their luggage was brought inside, their rooms were prepared, and from the outside, it looked like the normal arrival of important visitors. The lobby had polished floors, quiet staff, and the controlled calm of a place used to receiving men with titles, guards, and official appointments. The most important of the 3 was Imam Musa al-Sadr. He was 49 years old, unusually tall, charismatic, and politically powerful in Lebanon. People noticed him before he spoke because he stood around 6'6", but his influence came from more than his appearance. He was a cleric, a community leader, and a figure who could move crowds with a speech. Lebanon at the time was deep inside civil war. The country was divided by militias, sectarian fear, foreign influence, and a long chain of retaliations that ordinary families could not escape. Musa al-Sadr had become one of the most significant Shiite leaders in the region, and he was trying to shape events before the war destroyed even more of the country. That was why the trip to Libya mattered. Al-Sadr had accepted an official invitation to meet with Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan ruler whose power was personal, unpredictable, and absolute inside his own borders. A meeting with a dictator was never just a meeting. It was theater negotiation, risk, and calculation, all happening under the roof of a state where the host controlled the doors. At first, nothing about the hotel stay looked like a disappearance. The men were seen, their belongings were there, they were expected to attend official discussions. Diplomats, religious leaders, and political intermediaries traveled all the time in the Middle East during that period, trying to pull money, weapons, promises, or influence out of one capital and carry it into another. The normal explanation for any delay would have been scheduling. Gaddafi was not the kind of leader who had to respect another man's clock. Meetings could move, officials could make guests wait, cars could arrive late or not at all. In that world, a few hours of confusion did not immediately mean something had happened. Then Musa al-Sadr and his 2 companions walked out of the hotel for the meeting, and they did not come back. The first hours after that were probably filled with small explanations. Maybe the meeting ran long, maybe they were moved to another residence, maybe Libyan officials had taken them somewhere private. Men with political importance do not always leave a paper trail during tense negotiations. People around them can tell themselves that silence is part of the process, but the silence kept going. The rooms remained behind them, the luggage stayed untouched. The ordinary objects of travel became evidence of something wrong. Clothes, bags, papers, the things a person leaves in a hotel because they expect to return after the meeting. Those belongings made the disappearance feel unfinished. They had not packed to leave Libya. Libyan officials eventually gave an explanation. They said Musa al-Sadr and his companions had left for Rome. According to that version, the men had simply departed Libya and continued their journey elsewhere. It was a convenient answer because it moved responsibility out of Tripoli. If the men had gone to Italy, then Libya could claim the mystery belonged somewhere else. To support that story, luggage connected to the men appeared in an Italian hotel on the surface that could have solved the problem. A hotel in Rome, bags in a room, a travel path that seemed to continue after Libya. But planted evidence has a stillness to it when the rest of the story does not move with it. The luggage was there, but the men were not. Italian intelligence looked into the claim and found that the men had not entered Italy. That broke the Libyan version at its most practical point. People can disappear after entering a country, but records, airport movements, witnesses, and border processes leave traces. If al-Sadr and his companions had truly flown to Rome, the evidence should have been more than abandoned bags. The luggage began to look like a decoy, not a sophisticated one, but one made to give officials a sentence they could repeat. They went to Rome, their bags were found there, ask the Italians. That kind of explanation does not need to convince everyone. Sometimes it only needs to create enough confusion for time to pass. Back in Lebanon, the disappearance landed with enormous force. Musa al-Sadr was not just a private citizen missing abroad, he was a leader whose absence changed the emotional and political landscape of an already wounded country. His followers did not see his disappearance as a travel mishap. They saw a powerful man erased after walking into the territory of another powerful man. Suspicion quickly turned toward Gaddafi. The belief was that al-Sadr had met, or was supposed to meet, the Libyan leader, and that something went wrong between them. Some accounts centered on ideological conflict, a fierce argument, or a political disagreement, sharp enough that Gaddafi decided al-Sadr should never leave Libya alive. The normal objection was that killing such a famous religious figure would create lasting consequences. It would anger communities, damage relations, and turn al-Sadr into a symbol. But dictators do not always make decisions by the logic of outside observers. Inside a closed system, the ruler's pride can become policy. A disagreement in a room can become an order that no one nearby dares to question. The lack of bodies made everything worse. If al-Sadr and his companions had been found dead, the outrage would have been immediate and concrete. There would have been wounds to examine, a location to investigate, and a timeline to challenge. But disappearance is a different kind of violence. It lets the responsible people deny the ending while forcing families and followers to live without one. Rumors spread for years. Some said the men had been executed soon after the meeting. Others believed al-Sadr had been kept alive in a secret Libyan prison, hidden underground, or moved between facilities. That possibility was difficult to prove, but it survived because regimes like Gaddafi's Libya were built around hidden detention, secret punishments, and rooms the public never saw. The image of al-Sadr alive somewhere in Libya became almost impossible for some people to release. It carried hope, but it also carried torment. If he had been killed in 1978, then the crime was final. If he had been kept alive, then every year that passed became another year of captivity, another year in which someone might still have saved him. For Libya, the official denial continued. The state insisted on versions that kept responsibility away from Gaddafi. But the Rome story had already been badly damaged. Once a government uses a clumsy, false trail, every later statement begins to sound like another layer placed over the first lie. The untouched luggage in Tripoli and the staged luggage in Italy became two halves of the same suspicion. For Lebanon's Shiite community, al-Sadr's disappearance became a wound that did not close. Leaders can die and become martyrs, but a vanished leader occupies a different space. He is absent, but not fully gone. His followers can imagine his return. His enemies can never quite prove he is dead. His name remains active in politics because the unresolved question keeps summoning him back. The two companions who disappeared with him were also part of the silence. They had traveled with al-Sadr, trusted the same official invitation, and walked into the same last known movement. Their fates were folded into his, often overshadowed by his fame, but they were taken by the same event. 3 men entered Libya under official circumstances. 3 men vanished. As years turned into decades, the case became part of the wider history of Gaddafi's Libya. His government was known for violent acts beyond its borders, for intelligence operations, for imprisonment, and for treating human beings as pieces in political theater. In that context, the disappearance of Musa al-Sadr no longer sounded impossible. It sounded like something that belonged to the logic of the regime. Still, no final public proof emerged that could answer every question. No confirmed grave was opened, no verified prison record was produced. No universally accepted confession explained the sequence from hotel to meeting to disappearance. The strongest version remained a dark consensus. Al-Sadr and his companions were taken in Libya, and Gaddafi's state knew exactly what happened. The fall of Gaddafi many years later revived old hopes. When a dictatorship collapses, people imagine the hidden rooms will open and the files will come out. Families of the disappeared listen for names. Investigators look for archives, prison sites, former officials, and anyone willing to speak now that the old ruler is gone. But collapsed regimes do not always leave clean answers behind. They leave ruins, frightened witnesses, destroyed records, and competing stories. In al-Sadr's case, the collapse did not produce the complete resolution people had waited for. The rumors continued, the accusations continued. The belief that Gaddafi ordered his death remained strong, but the physical evidence needed to close the story stayed out of reach. The disappearance survived the man most suspected of causing it. That is what makes the case so difficult. It is not a mystery because no one can imagine what happened. It is a mystery because the most likely explanation has never been fully exposed in a way that gives the dead or the missing a final place. Everyone can see the outline. The hotel, the official invitation, the meeting, the false Rome trail, the silence afterward. But the center remains locked. Today, Musa al-Sadr is presumed assassinated, but the case remains unresolved. His disappearance still carries political and religious weight across Lebanon and the region. He became more than a missing man. He became proof of what could happen when a leader entered the private world of a dictator and did not come back out. The final image is not a battlefield in Lebanon or a prison cell in Libya. It is a hotel room in Tripoli after the men failed to return. The luggage is still there, arranged like the guests will be back soon. The beds are made, the hallway is quiet. Somewhere outside, official cars move through the city, and three men who came for a meeting have already crossed into a silence that decades of politics still have not broken. On June 17, 1980, inside a canvas tent in the Lopner Desert of western China, a man wrote a short note and left it behind. The paper did not contain a long explanation. It did not sound dramatic. It said he was going east to look for water wells. Then Peng Jiamu stepped out of the camp and into a white, dry emptiness that had already pushed his expedition close to its limit. Lopner was not a normal desert in the way people casually imagine sand and heat. It was a salt desert, a dead basin of hard light and distance known to many as the Sea of Death. The ground could look pale and endless under the sun, with salt flats stretching so far that distance became difficult to judge. Heat rose off the surface until the horizon seemed to loosen. Peng was 55 years old, a respected biochemist and explorer, and he was not there by accident. He had spent years working in difficult regions, and by 1980 he was one of China's celebrated scientific figures. The expedition into Lopner was dangerous, but it also carried national meaning. It was science, endurance, and state ambition all folded into one journey. The region itself had a history that made it feel removed from ordinary life. Lopner was remote enough and harsh enough that China had used it for nuclear weapons testing. That detail said something about the landscape. It was a place distant from cities, distant from crowds, and distant from easy rescue. A place where even governments treated emptiness as useful. At first, the expedition had a practical purpose. Peng and his team were collecting scientific data mapping conditions and pushing through terrain few people could handle for long. They had vehicles, supplies, equipment, and a plan. In a hostile place, those things create confidence. Not comfort, but confidence. A person can look at water cans, fuel maps, and radios and believe the danger is being managed. But deserts do not need to attack quickly. They can simply make every resource smaller. Water goes down, fuel goes down, strength goes down, each day takes something, and the land gives back almost nothing. In Lopner, there was no shaded village just ahead, no roadside store, no stream hidden beyond the next rise. There was only distance and heat. By the time the expedition reached a crisis point, the water supply had become the central problem. The team needed water badly enough that requesting outside help became a real option. A military airlift could save them, but it would be expensive. For Peng, that cost mattered. He was a scientist, but he was also a man shaped by duty to the state and the expedition. The normal decision would have been to request help anyway. People can replace money, fuel, and equipment. They cannot replace a dead team. But Peng seems to have looked at the situation differently in those final hours. He believed there might be wells to the east, or at least he believed strongly enough to act. And instead of waking everyone into a long debate, he left the note. That note became the center of the case because it was the last clear action anyone could hold. I am going to the east to find water wells. Simple, functional, almost calm. It sounded like a man stepping away for a task, not walking out of history. But in Lopner, direction is not the same as safety. East could mean survival, or it could mean an endless glare with no water anywhere. When the team realized Peng was gone, the situation changed immediately. A missing person in a city creates search areas of streets, stations, rooms, and witnesses. A missing person in Lopner creates a circle of emptiness that grows with every hour. Footprints can vanish. Heat can blur vision. A man can walk beyond sight turns slightly and become impossible to locate. The first explanation was that he had gone only a short distance and would return. Maybe he had found a low place, a track, or a sign of an old water source. Maybe he had misjudged how long he would be gone. Maybe he was just beyond the nearest rise. The team could still imagine him walking back tired and thirsty, carrying news that justified the risk. But Peng did not return. A search began, and because of who he was, it became massive. The Chinese government sent planes, military convoys, and tracking dogs. People moved across the desert trying to find a body, a footprint, a scrap of clothing, a canteen, anything that would turn the blank space into a path. The scale of the search showed how important Peng was. It also showed how difficult the desert was. Searchers were not looking for a hidden criminal or a person trying to disappear. They were looking for a scientist on foot in one of the most punishing environments in the country. In theory, that should make the search easier. A man leaves camp, a direction is written, follow east, find him. But Lopner did not cooperate with the logic of a map. The heat would have worked against him almost immediately. Temperatures in that region could rise to levels where the body begins losing water faster than a person can think clearly. Thirst does not just make a person uncomfortable, it changes judgment. It makes distances seem wrong, it makes the simplest decision harder. Eventually, the body begins shutting down while the mind still tries to solve the next step. The salt flats added another problem. They can look solid and flat, but they do not offer landmarks the way a forest or town does. A person walking across them can drift off course without noticing. The horizon stays far away. The ground repeats itself. Behind you, the camp becomes smaller, then invisible. Ahead of you, everything looks like the same white surface under the same hard sky. Dogs were used, but even dogs have limits in that kind of place. Scent behaves differently in heat and wind, tracks can become useless, vehicles can only move where the ground allows, aircraft can scan enormous areas, but a human body on a pale desert floor can become a small still shape among countless other shapes. The search found no trace of him, no confirmed remains, no personal item, no final shelter, no mark that said Peng had stopped here, fallen here, or turned back here. For investigators and search teams, that absence was difficult to accept. A man had left a tent on foot, not boarded a ship or aircraft. The desert was vast, but it was still ground. And yet, the ground gave nothing back. As time passed, Peng's disappearance became more than a failed search. It became a national story. In China, he was remembered as a scientist who sacrificed himself for his team and for the mission. That interpretation gave meaning to the note and to his final decision. He had walked east to find water, trying to save resources and avoid burdening the state with an expensive rescue. But there is a hard edge beneath that heroic version. A leader leaving camp alone in a lethal desert also created the danger that consumed him. He may have meant to protect the expedition, but his absence forced a far larger rescue effort than the airlift he hoped to avoid. That contradiction does not make him less brave. It makes the moment more human. He made a decision under pressure, and the desert gave him no chance to revise it. Other theories appeared, as they often do, when a body is never found. Some people wondered whether he had been taken, whether there was an accident involving terrain, no one located, whether he had entered a restricted area connected to nuclear testing, or whether some official detail had been hidden. In a remote, state-controlled region, speculation can grow in the spaces where documents and bodies are missing. But the simplest explanation remained the strongest. Peng walked out alone, searching for water, and died somewhere beyond the reach of the search. The problem is not that this explanation is hard to imagine. The problem is that it leaves no object to close the case. No bones, no field notebook, no final mark in the salt, just a note, a direction, and a landscape large enough to swallow both. For his team, the moment of finding the note must have carried a specific kind of dread. At first, the words may have seemed responsible. He had not vanished without saying anything. He had left instructions. But then, the meaning shifted. The note was not a message from a man doing a task. It was the last evidence of a man already gone too far to call back. The searchers kept trying. Planes crossed the sky. Vehicles cut across the flats. Men scanned the ground and called into heat that did not answer. Every search has a rhythm: move, stop, look, listen, move again. In Lop Nur, that rhythm would have been broken by the scale. There was always another stretch ahead, another direction. He might have taken another place where a person could fall and disappear into brightness. No trace was found. That phrase is short, but in this case, it carries the whole weight of the desert. It means every tool available at the time failed. It means people trained to search could not turn the last note into a body. It means the place where Peng died, if he died there, remained private to the landscape. The desert did not only kill him, it kept him. Peng Jiamu was eventually presumed dead, but presumption is not the same as recovery. A recovered body allows a final examination, a final route, a final place. Without that, his story stays fixed at the opening of the tent. The moment before he stepped into the heat is more visible than whatever happened after, because after that, the record turns blank. His disappearance also became a symbol of scientific sacrifice in a period when exploration and national service were deeply connected. He represented the kind of person willing to put himself in dangerous places for knowledge and for the country. That symbolism made the story powerful, but it also made the unanswered physical facts easier to blur. Symbols do not need footprints. Families and investigators do. The Lop Nur Desert remains the dominant character in the story because no suspect replaces it. There is no killer to arrest, no confession to analyze, no courtroom to settle the final sequence. There is only the environment and one decision made under pressure. Peng looked at dwindling water, weighed the cost of rescue, wrote a few words, and walked east. Today, the disappearance of Peng Jiamu remains unsolved. He is presumed to have died in the desert, but his remains have never been found. The official memory honors him as a scientist who gave everything in the pursuit of knowledge. The mystery remains because honor does not answer where his body went, how far he walked, or what he saw in his final hours. The final image is almost motionless. A dusty canvas tent in the middle of Lop Nur, maps and supplies inside. A team not yet aware that their leader has gone. On the paper, a short note saying he went east to find water wells. Outside, the salt flats stretch white and empty under a sun that makes distance unreliable. Peng Jiamu walks into that light, and after that, even the desert leaves no witness.